With me for this interview is Eli Macaraeg, the segment manager of industrial blasting with Bullard. Eli, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate having you on this program. What I wanted to focus on first is related to the coatings industry. What are some of the potential respiratory health hazards?
Sure. Well, when you're looking at the coatings industry, I think you have to look at it from two different positions first. It's not just the application side, but you also have to look at it from a surface preparation side. Now, to sort of talk about that part, you have to understand that in surface preparation, the most common technique is abrasive blasting. SSPC has a C7 course that trains applicators and trains our end users on that. Essentially, that process is about removing old paint. It could be removing rust, mill scale, dirt, salts. Abrasive blasting can actually also be found in fabrication of pipings, steel plates, steel members for assembly. One of the things to note that abrasive blasting, though, the potential hazard or the primary potential hazard in that is exposure to dust and air contaminants. Now, for those that are familiar with our industry, you know that type of process generates large quantities of dust that contain high levels of really toxic and respirable contaminants in the air. Mm-hmm. And you could, seeing the sources, I guess, of where that comes from, you can pretty much say that they come from three primary sources or contributors to those types of toxins. The first is the base material that's being blasted. So you're looking at things like steel, you're looking at aluminum, you're looking at copper alloys. A second potential source of contaminants is from the surface coating itself. You have your pre-construction primers, you have your anti-corrosives. In the shipyard industry, you have anti-fouling paints, concrete, cement. Can actually fall under this category, or actually the first category of the base material that's being blasted. Mm-hmm. But the primary contributor and the last contributor to contaminants in this industry is the media that's being used. You have your coal, you have your copper, your nickel slags, glass, steel grit, garnet, and then silica sand, and hopefully a lot of that's already been wiped away. But these are what you would call the potential contributors, because it when they turn into respirable quantities, things like aluminum, lead, air, iron, zinc, these are things that can get in the air from these sources. Crystalline silica, beryllium, those are the hot topics in our industry today, because they could lead to things like silicosis. They could lead to CBD, which is chronic beryllium disease, respectively. And these are both lung diseases that are linked to cancer. So as far as potential hazards, that's just the surface prep side.
Yeah, no, the thing on with this, you were just talking about some of those hazards type of materials. It really doesn't take a whole lot of that exposure to cause an issue.
No, it doesn't. And these types of exposures can actually hit you in sort of an immediate reaction, or in some cases can be long-term effects.
Yeah,
I know. I touched up on the surface prep side, but a little bit too is on the coating application side, which is the second part of the hazards for our industry. You're looking at solvent vapors from the spray coatings that our end users are using, the adhesives, the paints, the strippers, the cleaning solvents that they have, and in reality, dust again. Those are the ones that are found when you're adding dry ingredients to a mixture, right? Or the vapors and dust that are involved, they can be sensitizing. You're exposed to isocyanates, certain epoxies, again, beryllium. These are things that, you could develop reactions to over time or through an exposure. And all of these are pretty hazardous. So as far as the coating industry on the application, our end users out there, they're exposed to some things that they really need protection for, because it's not optimal conditions in the lab where they're spraying or blasting these things. They're working in confined spaces. They're working in reality too. Another hazard is, there's oxygen deficiency in these confined spaces. So having sort of the right type of respiratory care can really contribute to making sure their health is looked after.
So when we look at respiratory safety, it's very intense, and the aspect of the protection equipment. What are some of the types that are available of respiratory safety equipment to the coatings industry?
Yeah, so there's different categories, of course. You have the industry standards of what they like to say is our tight fitting respirators, and these would include the half mask, the full face mask, and these type of respirators would have to require a fit testing for the employer and the user. Fit testing to make sure that there's a proper seal, so that there's no sort of exposure that gets in, making sure workers don't, like yourself, you wouldn't be able to do a fit testing because you have a beard. So a beard has to be removed. Otherwise, there's no proper seal there. And then there's another category, which is what we call our loose fitting. And these are our hoods and our helmets. You might see them in the pharmaceutical industry, where they have sort of a huge white Tyvek suit, and then the hood that kind of goes over, and that's what we call a loose fitting. In terms of the surface prep industry, you have abrasive blasting helmets. That's a hood or a helmet. And then there's the new technology out there that has the loose fitting, where it combines 3-in-1 type systems, where it has, let's say, a head protection for industries that require head protection, and then you have the respiratory protection that provide the respiratory needs for the exposure, and then of course you have the impact side to make sure you're protected from that aspect. So those are essentially your two major categories of protection, but then they could also be broken up in different types of classes as well. There's the air purifying sort of technology, where it's filters and cartridges that remove contaminants from the air as it's going into an individual. And then there's the what you would consider the atmosphere supplying, where it's providing clean, breathable air from an uncontaminated source. So SAR is the word that you'll hear in the industry, which is supplied air respirator, or PAPR, which is a powered air purifying respirator. So and this all falls under the line of atmosphere supplying. So there's different types of technologies out there that fits different job process. It's essentially understanding what sort of hazards your employees or you as a user are exposed to, and making sure you're doing what you can to protect yourself to those exposures.
So with all the different types of equipment that are available, and looking at the protective coatings industry, we go through a lot of craft worker training related to surface prep and coating application. So in addition to that, you have craft workers that have to take, for example, lead training on how to handle lead during the abrasive blasts and handling and things like that. So when it comes to the respiratory safety and equipment, what type of training is currently available to the industry?
Well, the majority of the training should be provided by the employer. For any sort of respiratory program that most facilities have, there should be in that program things like documentation, things like hazards they're exposed to. Some facilities, manufacturing of coating companies, they have monthly monthly safety meetings that discuss that. But a lot of the education that an employee or user has, they can get that from organizations like SSPC. They can get that from manufacturers that supply these type of equipment. They can go to OSHA websites to try to learn and understand about regulatory compliance. I know as far as the surface prep industry, there's certain standards. The way these equipment or this technology comes to being manufactured is they're tested by a company called NIOSH, and NIOSH is the certifying body for respiratory equipment. And the way it's tested, the way it's marketed, and the way it's sold has to fit a certain criteria. For example, in the abrasive blasting community, you have to have a type CE respirator in order to be able to continue in your job process, meaning it has to be able to withstand not just respiratory protection, but ricochets from the media that's bouncing off. So those are things that an organization like NIOSH tests for. Regulatory type rules where we like to say from hose to nose. You have a compressor that's supplying air to an end user. As required by OSHA and NIOSH, you have to have a CO monitor attached to that. And then from that monitor, the hose that goes all the way up to the hood of a user has to be all compliant with the same manufacturer. And that's because that's essentially how it was tested when it was going through certification process. So I think end users out there essentially have to do their due diligence and making sure they're in compliant in terms of for their workers. And the guidance from that can come a lot from not just OSHA, but again, from what I said, manufacturers like us in helping guide that for the industry. Because in the end, we want to make sure everyone is protected and being protected by a system that is certified and tested to work properly. So
when we look at hazardous materials, for example, like silica or lead, those tend to take more of a longer exposure, and there's tests that can be done, especially in the relationship to lead, where you can actually draw blood samples at the work site and be able to determine lead exposure if it has occurred. We're now into 2020. Expected at the end of this year, the beryllium rule will kick in. In looking at that rule that will go into place, that again, you cannot test for beryllium on the job site, and the exposure limits are very, very small exposures limits. Is there any? What do you see training-wise? Or potentially certification-wise related to respiratory safety that might be needed as this beryllium rule goes into effect in our industry?
Yeah, so as far as what training is needed, from my own, this is clearly my own perspective, but I think a lot of that has to be driven not just by OSHA, but also manufacturers. I know Bullard is actually taking a stance and making sure we're communicating the right type of standards and updates to standards to our end users out there, because in reality, what we want to do is making sure they're protected, not just from what they're doing currently, but as you said, it's something that will follow them decades from now. You can't necessarily test for it now. It's something that'll get you, several years from now. We want to be able to be there. So driving that education, I think it's essentially the responsibility of the owners and the end user themselves. But you have that support from the manufacturers to make sure you're protected going forward.
It's definitely a combined and coordinated effort. Eli, we talked a lot about potential hazards related to respiratory safety. We talked about different types of equipment, and then the training and certification needs related to craft workers for their protection. In this interview, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would want to talk about it in closing?
Well, I think getting a good general idea of the hazards that you're exposed to. We sort of take responsibility on our own on making sure we're protected first. So the onus or the representation of making sure we're using our PPE properly, making sure we're using the right, correct PPE. The responsibility essentially falls on us. But getting a sort of a general idea and hopefully understanding that there are avenues out there for you to be able to reach out to. Again, organizations like SSPC who have the C7 and C12 classes and do go over certain portions on PPE. And you do have the support again of manufacturers, and then of course OSHA. All of those things, and if you're working in a good place as well, you know, the owners and supervisors take that lead. It's one thing that I always believe in, that safety is something that you don't necessarily can compromise on, and it's a universal topic that you can talk to, from you know, the person out there spraying to the CEO of a company, and you don't compromise on it. So it's essentially from top down, but it's that serious of an issue that you want to protect them as much as you want to protect yourself.
I definitely agree. It's a very serious issue. For those watching this interview, in the comments below, I'll have Eli's contact information if you have additional questions for Eli. And I'll also have a link for the Bullard website, so you can take a look at some of the information that Bullard has available in some of the products and solutions that they have related to respiratory safety in the protective coatings industry. Eli, I very much appreciate your time and the opportunity to interview you. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Jim. Appreciate it very much.
Have a great day.
You too. You too.